Gospels. If you take a look at the Gospels and other portions of the New Testament and some parts of the Old Testament, but especially the Gospels when Jesus spoke, especially if you're from this region in which we are sitting right now, the Galilee. If you were from that era and you heard Matthew's Gospel, you heard things from Luke's Gospel, you heard things from John, you heard a couple of things from Mark, certain things would pass through your head that has probably never entered your mind. Or if it has, it might have been one little blip here and that's about it because somebody discovered something. What I want to share with you is something that was discovered by an awful lot of other people. But nobody had ever quite put it all together into one big chunk. So what I did is I put all their pieces together. And there are more pieces out there, and this thing is still under study because finding what I'm going to explain to you is not like the biblical dinner, where parts of it are lying around all over the place. They're in all kinds of commentaries and all kinds of histories and, just exciting things. This one, the best source of it is in the Bible. So how do you say, I know what I'm looking at, if the best source of it's in the Bible and you don't hear anything from it on the outside of the Bible? Good question. So it's a long investigative process that comes to these conclusions. But the most important thing to remember is that if Jesus' disciples all knew what he was talking about when he spoke, there are some areas in the Bible where we scratch our heads and say, wow, that sounds very philosophical. That sounds like a riddle. And a lot of commentators treat it like a riddle or a philosophy. And then they write about it as such. Well, you're going to see something that they saw, especially if you were a Galilean. That's why I'm so this is a rare privilege for me, that I actually get to talk about this in Galilee, because it's about this wedding. Now, a Galilean wedding was different than a Judean wedding. Judean weddings were the same thing as Galilean weddings, as Arab weddings, as regional indigenous peoples' weddings. They were all the same, except the Galileans had one thing that was different. And when we get to that, it's an eye-opener, because that's why I want to concentrate on this area, because they did one thing differently, and Jesus referred to it on more than one occasion. And unless you were a Galilean, you didn't see it. Marriage is being fought over now, and it's a brutal fight in the secular world. It's a brutal fight within the church. Marriage is being redefined. But marriage now in this world, and especially in the Western world, is being redefined arbitrarily. People want marriage to mean different things because they want it to mean something different for me. As if marriage was something that was arbitrarily created. But you see, God made marriage. I find it fascinating that why, you have to ask the question, do people want marriage so badly? Now let's pick on the homosexuals for a second, okay? They want marriage. Why do they want it?
Equality.
They don't need it. They don't have to have it. But why do they want that? They can have a civil union with all the benefits, and all the states could pass it, and they could even come out better than married couples as far as tax benefits go. But why do they want marriage? Why is that being picked on? Why is marriage something that for other people is something that's merely an obligation that I don't want to obligate myself to? Living together is more than enough. Why is this? And it's there in society, and it permeates the debates and the arguments going on in our culture, and they're decades-long debates. Marriage is kind of like God's law. You remember that Paul said, the person that doesn't have the law, and I'm paraphrasing from Romans 2, has the law of God written where?
In hearts.
On their hearts. Every person in the world knows the same right and wrong. Even if their laws are different, as I said, to some sort of a very, very primitive person living in some island somewhere, their philosophy of life being very, very tribal, it might be right for them to murder their neighbor, but when their neighbor wants to murder them, it's wrong, isn't it? Why? Because murder is still wrong. Even if it's worked their way into their customs, it's still wrong because you can't kill me because that's wrong. Nobody ever lays down and says, yeah, go ahead, that's right. Except for Jesus. And you know the reasons why on that. Now, the same thing, I believe, I'm convinced, and it's a theory of mine, but I'm convinced it's true, is the same thing is true of marriage. Everywhere you go in the world, you find marriage. You find it among the Jews, the Christians, the Muslims, the Arabs, the tribal people in the darkest parts of New Guinea who have never seen a white person. You find it in Russia. You find it among the Aborigines in Africa. In Australia, you find it among the people of Africa. You find it everywhere in the world, and you find it going back as long as anyone can remember, and it's marriage. It's a man with a woman, sometimes a man with a lot of women, sometimes a woman with a lot of men, but it's still marriage, and it's still till death us do part. And it's this bond between two people. Why is that? And it's strange, too, because many of you have probably been to different weddings with different customs. And the customs would be, well, I see the wedding, and it's going on, and they're sharing a cup of rice wine, and the woman is dressed in a gown unlike anything I've ever seen in the West, but there she is, and the man is dressed in something traditional, and I don't quite get what's going on there, but they're getting married. And they're exchanging vows. And when they're done, nobody looks at that marriage, no matter where it's from, anywhere in the world, and says, this is only temporary. Have you ever noticed that? It's universal. Think about it. Just use your eyes and look around. And that's what you'll find. Marriage is something that God has put in each of our hearts. It's why we want it. It's why the homosexual community wants it. Because it's there. It's not something they're making up. Why marriage? Well, to us, marriage is sacred. Don't invade it. But wait a minute. To God, it's sacred. And He put it here for a reason. So that we would see something, that we would understand something, that, shall we say, the gears have been greased to move when the crank finally gets turned, because God's going to do something with it. In this region of the world, a couple of thousand years ago, and in this region of the world, not necessarily right here, but let's say just a few hundred miles from here in certain directions, things still are the same. I want to give you a hypothetical. There's going to be a wedding. And the wedding is an arranged marriage. It's a marriage where somebody decides, I want my kids to get married, and they have no say-so in it. There's all kinds of different ways that people can be put together, from all different types of ages. They could be an old man with a younger woman, rarely an older woman with a younger man, but you've got the Ruth and Boaz thing. People think that Boaz was quite old and Ruth was quite young. Yeah, perhaps. But you have marriages in this region, and we're going to create a hypothetical marriage, and we're going to show you how it works. Now, marriages were often political. They were useful. But in this part of the world, love was a very, very small, if not non-existent consideration. If the bride and the groom happen to love each other, that's a real plus. But if the bride and the groom don't care one whit for each other, it really doesn't matter. They're still going to get married. Because marriage in that part of the world was the coming together of two families, whether on a royal level or just a very, very common peasant level. And when you joined families together, you joined resources. So the family became somewhat wealthier, somewhat more powerful, or maybe a lot wealthier, maybe a lot more powerful, maybe a lot more influential in the community. Why did Solomon have 700 wives? Because the guy is just lustful, right? No, those were his concubines. A concubine is a lesser wife, if you didn't know that. Basically, a mistress, somebody bound to the man, and the only difference is that she performs all the duties of a wife, but none of the children that are produced from this relationship have any entitlements whatsoever. So in other words, they don't inherit a name, they don't inherit any part of the kingdom or a palace or anything else. They're just there, those concubines, forgive me, for fun. That's why they're there. That was Solomon's biggest downfall. But he was warned, don't mass up wives to yourselves because you're going to have problems. Look at David's life before Solomon. He had a dozen wives, and what a mess that was. Then he had the concubines, and Absalom used them against him to take away his kingdom because of some of their customs. Solomon had 700 wives because they were political marriages. He'd marry the daughter or the sister of some city-state over here, some kingdom or empire over there, and the next thing you know, he's connected to all these different political kingdoms and entities and cities, and now they're all allies. Because you're not going to go and kill your in-law. So, well, you might, I don't know. But this is the rule back then. These wives, these 700 wives, weren't because Solomon's walking down the street with his entourage and he goes, boy, she's pretty, send her to my harem, I'll take care of her later. No, it's nothing like that. He would carefully arrange who he married in order to expand the influence, the power, and the wealth of his kingdom. That's what all those wives were about. But the concubines were another matter. And this is where things really went bad and got out of control. But that's what the way things were back in those days. Now,
So,
if you wanted to... What's that?
No, nothing. I'll ask you later.
Okay. Now, if you wanted to get married in those days, you rarely had any say-so in it. When we're all done here and we're wrapping up, I will tell you about what it would be if you fell in love with somebody. But the chances of that in Jesus' day is very, very small. The way it would work, and again, here's one of a billion different scenarios. This is one of the simplest scenarios that I could possibly create. It's in the book. You can read about it if you read the book, you saw it. Where, let's say you have a papa. He's a merchant. And he's in his village and he's doing his business. And he's going from point A to point B to do whatever he's going to do. And as he's walking along, he sees a little group of small children and they're playing in the dust and they're doing whatever they're doing, having a lot of fun. And he's going to do his business and suddenly he stops. And he looks at this little girl, creeper. And no, he's not a creeper, he's a dad. And he looks at the girl and he says, boy, she's having fun. Look, she's very cute. She's very, very industrious. She's polite. Wow, and she's got lots of energy. She looks very healthy, looks strong. I'll bet she'd make a great wife for my son. Never mind the girl's 3 and the son is 4. That's what he looks at. You say, that's really sick. No, it's not. This is the way they do things. And so he decides on that girl. He says, I know who the father is. I don't think she's taken yet. So he goes home and he begins to prepare a feast. And he'll discuss it perhaps with his wife. Maybe he won't because she really doesn't have a whole lot of say-so in this. But he'll decide this is what I want to do. And because her family is important, this could be a huge benefit to our family. So he goes home and he prepares a feast. Whatever he can put together. If he's very poor, he does the best he can. If he's wealthier, he really does it up to the hilt. And then he sends one of his family members, or if he has servants, a servant, over to this guy's house, pounds on the door, and says, my master has a gospel for you. Only good news. I want you to come to my master's house for a feast. And if the guy agrees, he just drops everything and goes, because that's the way you did it in those days. You know how people complain about, and this is going to sound maybe bad, but I mean it in the very best of ways, that in Mexico, you have the mañana attitude, like things never get done. The reason why is the people don't care much about clocks down there. They care more about the honor of just getting things done for their friends. So things don't get done right away down there. We Americans, we get all upset about it because we have to keep track of that clock. These guys, back then, they had no clocks. They did the same thing. They got their work done when they got it done. They had their relationships done when they got it done. It's a much more relaxed lifestyle. And so somebody comes to the door and says, come over. They pound on the door. The guy just says, oh, sure, I'll go. Because he suspects what's going on anyway. And so off he goes to the house. A feast is always good. And so he comes in. He's greeted warmly by this papa of the little boy. And he gets a holy kiss. And he gets all the gifts of hospitality. And he reclines at the table. Food is brought in. And they lay there and they talk for a day or two.
Wow.
It just goes on and they chat, they sit in silence, they have some friends come by and say hello and maybe enjoy some of the feast and then move on, whatever happens. And then after a couple of days of wining and dining this fellow, the papa of the little boy then drops the question, how about your daughter becoming betrothed rather, to my son? And if the papa of the little girl says yes, which probably would, because after all this whining and dining, you really do owe him something. And besides, she's only a girl. See, you gotta think think back then. So let's put that sounds terrible. That's the way it was. So, okay, we can do this. So immediately, the guy calls in somebody who can read and write well. Whether it's himself or whether it's somebody else, but there has to be a witness that it's done. So he starts bringing people into this feast, the papa of the boy. And they begin to write down in exact duplicate, what they're about to discuss. They do a thing called a ketubah. In America, they call it a ketubah. That's sort of a Yiddish pronunciation. A ketubah is a contract. This is the marriage contract, and they're going to put this thing together. So on the contract, they have to have 2 identical copies, so they're going to actually get out the pen and paper and start writing, right? No. What are they going to get a pen and a paper? You're going to go down to Staples and buy it? No. What are you going to write on?
Pottery shards.
Pottery shards, leather, wood, stone. What do you have? This is what you're going to write on. And so you bring in your scribe, whoever that is, and they're going to begin to write 2 exact copies of this bargaining session. And then it goes into haggling. You, of course, spend enough time in the old city. You've seen the haggling that happens. Same thing goes on. They start haggling over the little girl. The little girl, first of all, you got to buy her. So you got to pay the price. And they start haggling over the price of the girl. Well, what do you want for the... Now, how much do you think is fair? Well, I'm willing to offer you 20 camels and 10 donkeys and a small flock of sheep. No. I want 40 camels and 40 donkeys and 100 sheep. No. And they finally get it back down, haggle back and forth on the price, and it ends up at 20 camels and 10 donkeys and a small flock of sheep. But of course, they haggle back and forth, and then this price is written in the ketubah. This is the price of the bride to be presented on their day of betrothal. It's got to be presented by the father of the bridegroom to the father of the bride on that day. And then they begin to haggle about other things. What about the bride's dowry? The dowry in those days, in this part of the world, was a little bit different than the dowries that you think of. They would use coins, or they might have other things, like they could use expensive items like expensive perfume. They could use crops even if you needed to do that. But yeah, that wasn't very good because it didn't last, but it was worth something. But the dowry was there in case something happened to the man, to the husband. He left her, he died, or he became disabled in some way. So you had to have some way to support the bride. So the father of the bride had to be able to present the father of the bridegroom. This sounds backwards, but this is what they did here. The father of the bride had to present the father of the bridegroom with a certain amount of agreed upon money. That this is what the dowry is going to be in case anything happens to the man. The bridegroom's father would have to agree on it, and at the betrothal is going to have to inspect it to make sure that it's legal in front of all the witnesses. So they do this, and this goes into these 2 exact copies of this contract called the ketubah. 2 copies, and that's put down. And then they put things in there like, what is how many kids of what gender are they going to have?
Really? What?
Yeah, they would do this on occasion. Now you look at that and you go, how do they do that? Wishful thinking, I'm sure, wishful thinking. But this is what was part of the contract, that they were going to have children, they were going to have so many boys, and they were going to have maybe some girls. Remember, girls were not counted as worth much in those days. So the boys were everything, and how many you're going to have? In other words, you just keep trying until you can't have any more, until you fulfill that contract. Have you ever wondered why it was a disgrace for women not to have children in those days? Ever consider? It was not just the fact that you couldn't have children. If you're married, breach of contract. Breach of contract. So that was a shameful thing. So they would even put that in the ketubah. And all the other details, and they write it all down, and when they're done, they would embrace one another, give each other a holy kiss, and then they would break up the feast, and the papa of the girl would go home, and the papa of the boy would take his ketubah, both of them each with their own copy of this ketubah. And they would take it home and put it in, as we've discussed here before, what we would call their holiest shrine. Now, what would that be? Well, it could be a box in a field. Remember the strong box that the man in the parable finds in the field and then goes buys the whole field? It could be something like that. It could be a hole in a wall. It could be hidden in the ground somewhere. But it's a place where you kept all the items that you use for ceremonial purposes. The most precious things you had. Think the family safe, wherever it might be. Because they didn't have places to put these unless you lived near the temple. And then you would stick them in the temple because the temple's like a bank. Otherwise, you got to find a hole in the ground somewhere to put it. So, children are 4, 3 years old. The ketchup was made. Now it's hidden away with all the important documents and things of the family. Well, the children grow up. Now we're going to assume that the papas live. They don't die of some disease or they're killed or crippled or something. We're just going to assume a best case scenario that everybody lives through all of this, okay? So the kids grow up and they become of age to marry, and it's time for them to go through the betrothal ceremony. And the betrothal ceremony is everything. Now, at the ripe old age of about 14 and 15 years old, they're brought out to get betrothed together. You say that's ridiculous. Not really. You know all the pressures we have in Western society about dating? This would really resolve all of the temptations right there. Get them married off early and they don't have a whole lot of temptations to worry about. Of course, only parents like myself will understand that. Someday you're going to be in that boat and you're going to go, boy, I wish we had arranged marriages. Because you'll see it. But so, the day begins to approach. It's been a while. One of the papas sends a communication to the other papa. It's time to get these kids betrothed because we want to do a wedding in about a year. If the other family is agreeable to it, then they pick a day in which to have the betrothal ceremony. And as I said, the betrothal ceremony is everything. It's even more important than the wedding. More important than the wedding. So, as the day approaches, they begin making preparations. They start putting together, patching up clothes and doing all kinds of things. And finally the day arrives and the morning pops for the boy and for the girl. The kids come in, the siblings, the little sisters, little brothers, whatever, they come in, the girls with the girls, the guys with the guys, maybe the mom's there with the girls and the dad's there with the guys, and they come in and the uncles and aunts and all that, all the women here, all the men over there in these 2 different houses because you got the girl here and the guy there, and they surround them in the morning and they wake them up because it's going to be a great celebration, and they help them get dressed and cleaned up and fix their hair and dress them as nice as they can, and they give them some food and they eat the food because they've got to have, be nice and alert for that day, and food is kind of hard to come by back then. And the first place they take them is to the synagogue. Of course, they would go at different times in different areas of the synagogue, because if whenever you're going to do something very sacred or very holy, you always start it with a dip in what? Mikvah. The mikvah. So they got to do the mikvah. So the first thing in the morning, they go and do the mikvah. Now they're ceremonially clean to get married. You say, well, this is a betrothal. It's a betrothal. But at the betrothal, they are officially married. So, they do the dip in the mikvah, then they go back to their homes, the family gets all excited, they get all the ceremonial things out that they need for this particular project to do this betrothal, and they get musical instruments, they get tambourines, they get drums, they just do all of these crazy things, and then, of course, they start making noise at the houses. And the houses across the village, you can hear each family getting ready, and they're singing, and they're pounding on things, and they're beating drums, and the other family hears it, and they respond, and then just at the right time, because you hear it all coming to a crescendo, everybody shouts and roars, they blow shofars, and people burst out of the houses. And you've got whole families going with the guy and a whole family going with the girl, coming from whatever their respective homes are in this particular village, and they begin to make their way singing and dancing and blowing trumpets and waving things around in the air and shouting, and they're coming down to the village or city gate. That's with the wall that surrounds the city, and they're heading to the gate. As they come to the gate, here come these 2 parades of people, and hopefully they kind of meet at the same time, and people are coming in and out of the gate of the village. These guys cram through the gate and they come through, and you've got this massive group of people that are celebrating and singing, and here comes the bride dressed beautifully, not in her wedding clothes, but in nice clothes. The bridegroom dressed nicely, and he's in his best that he can put on at the moment. He's going to be dressed better later. And as they come through, somebody comes through, a bunch of guys, usually younger men, with a bundle of poles with cloth wrapped around the top of it. And they barge through like a battering ram practically, and they lead the way outside the gate. Outside the gate, And they find a likely spot, someplace that they say, this is a good place to do this. Then they take the poles, they set them upright, each one of the boys grabs one of the poles, and they pull out. And when they do, suddenly the cloth at the top extends into a canopy. And you have this thing that's called a huppah. H-U-P-P-A is the way we would spell it, or H-U-P-P-A-H, if you want to spell it that way. But you have a huppah. Did you guys ever see Fiddler on the Roof?
Yeah.
Where does a wedding take place? Under a canopy. It's called a huppah. Now that's a wedding, but remember, this is long after the fall of the temple. We're talking about events before the fall of the temple here in this region. So they took the huppah to the betrothal. They pull it out, you have a canopy. Suddenly, all the people that are outside the gate, maybe there's a caravan going by, maybe there's beggars, maybe there's merchants out by the gate, maybe there are elders by the gate, and those guys are important, you want them to be there. They see the huppah go up, and they say, hey, there's going to be a betrothal. Let's go watch, because what else are they going to do? They don't have smartphones to play with all day long. They're sitting around waiting for something to happen. And suddenly this huppah goes up. Let's go watch. Are they invited? Oh, yes. Because when that huppah goes up, the two families want something. They want, well, at our weddings, we want guests. You know what they want? Witnesses. You've got to have witnesses. Why? Because a covenant is about to be made, and no covenant can be made without a witness. You have to have witnesses, so the more they got, the better. And the witnesses know exactly what they're supposed to do. Every time part of the covenant is made, they're supposed to say, amen. The witnesses all say,
Amen.
no. The witnesses shout,
Amen.
no, the witnesses shout!
Amen.
That's what they do. Yes, because it's a time that they're looking forward to. This is great. Somebody's going to get married. Let's go watch. This will be fun, and we get to participate. We get to be the witnesses. So, the huppah goes up, and then the bride and groom come and stand under the huppah. Bride and groom.
Yay!
There's the bride. Where's the bride? There he is. Hanging back there. Come here. You stand right here. Bridegroom stand right over here. Okay, now the father of the bride is going to stand over behind his daughter here. So father of the bride, come over here, stand over here, please. Father of the bridegroom is going to stand over here, please. There you go. So you have these people now, and they're standing underneath this huppah. These guys aren't under the huppah. These guys are. Because the huppah means something to them. The huppah is not just a canopy, and it's not just to keep them in the shade, though that's a nice thing in this part of the world, isn't it? You definitely want to make sure they don't sweat too much. But if you read the book, you probably noticed something about that huppah. The huppah is not what a lot of people have said in modern times, where you have a prayer shawl over the top of the poles because they're getting married underneath the prayers of God. If that ever was the case, it's new, it's not ancient. In ancient times, it was the finest piece of cloth anybody could find, and they put it over their heads, because everything that's going to happen here is supposed to look like it was in the days of Moses. The pattern of the betrothal resembles the time of Moses. When Moses was given the covenant of God, when he went up on the mountain, what happened? The glory of God descended up on the mountain. And that was God in the glory. The canopy, the cloth on the top, is the cloud descending on the place of the covenant. That's what happens. Under the cloud, a covenant is made. And then in that covenant, something comes out of it that Moses takes back down the hill and he begins to build.
The tabernacle.
The tabernacle. A place, a house where God will live with his people. So they modeled the whole ceremony after Moses receiving the covenant on Sinai. The huppah represents holding up the cloud, and the covenant's made under the cloud. So, guys, stand here on the carpet. We're just going to pretend it's kind of the shadow of the huppah. So the first thing that happens is everybody sees them. They get together here. The families are packed around them, all around. And then the witnesses are all around the outside of them. And the first thing that happens is that the father of the bridegroom now must physically present the father of the bride with the price of the bride. And so he motions over there, blows yes, and brings them in perfect. That's exactly what
Bring
they
the
do.
donkeys.
They bring the donkeys, they bring the camels, they bring them in. And the father of the bride inspects them, he counts them, he makes sure that they're okay. And he looks through, are they all right? And they're okay. And he agrees, and everybody shouts. So the price of the bride is acceptable, and that part of the covenant is now ratified. And now, the next thing that happens is that the dowry is now produced by the father of the bride. And of course, he brings out some bronze coins because they decided to work it on coins. Those are just agarwal, forget it. So they rattle pretty well. And he brings out the coins that were agreed to, the exact amount that's in the ketubah, and he hands them over to the father of the bridegroom, who inspects them publicly. So that as he looks at these things, he pours them out, he counts them, and then he realizes this is the exact amount. And that means that when he agrees and he shakes his head like that, everybody knows that he can't go back on it. Nobody can say, I didn't know, I got cheated. You accepted it in front of all those witnesses right then and there. And so he, go ahead and give me the pouch. So he takes the pouch, he hands it back to the father of the bride, and then he will keep it back in that sacred spot that they have, their little holy place where they keep everything. And that's where it's going to stay in case something happens to him. Otherwise, it stays in the family on this side. So the amount is acceptable?
Amen.
Amen. Everybody shouts.
Amen.
This is ratified. Now the ketubah is done, is being fulfilled. It's the most important part. I forgot to tell you. They start by reading the ketubah. They begin this whole thing because they read it together. One of them reads it, or they have somebody who can read it. In case they can't read, it's read to everybody, and they hear all the stipulations of it. Then, of course, everybody shouts.
Amen.
Because you've agreed on the stipulations, and of course the price of the bride's in there, and the dowry is in there, and now they know it. Now everything focuses down to these two in front. And they would give each other wedding gifts. Now, I don't have any props to give you because I didn't bring them from the States. But what you would give to each other in those days, it could have been a receipt. Take care of the receipt. Yes, the plastic is on hold. So, no, seriously, what would happen in those days? The bridegroom would give the bride the most valuable gift he could give her, he could afford to give her on his own. Now, the big story is, yes, you're beautiful, beautiful. You should get married. Here's what he would typically give her. If he was wealthy enough, he would give her a gold ring for her nose. Really? Nose ring was a wedding ring. They would do that. He could give her a pouch full of coins. He could give her some valuable ointment of something. It's just something like that. But listen, if he were poor, what could he give her? That's a good question, isn't it? One of the traditions that they had was that if this was a very poor peasant family, the bridegroom could pull out even a widow's mite, if it was. It could be a very, very small coin, like a little bronze pruta, and he could hand it to her, and she would be blessed by taking it because he just gave her everything he had. See? So even a tiny worthless coin could be worth everything in the world publicly to all of you guys and to her, because he just gave her everything he had and everybody knows it. So it could be like that too. And so they've exchanged gifts. Now they've exchanged gifts. It's very nice. It's moving towards the wedding, and all the witnesses shout.
Amen.
Now comes the most important part of all. The bridegroom is then handed a pitcher with wine, ceremonial wine, so it's straight. He now takes a ceremonial cup, which is something that's kept in their little hoard of precious things, and he pours the wine into the cup. And he hands the pitcher back, and takes the pitcher, and then he hands his bride the cup. Now, before she takes it, I have to tell you something. This is an arranged marriage. This is an arranged marriage. The moment he pours that cup and advances it towards her and holds it out, suddenly she is given authority and power in this marriage that nobody else has at any time in the marriage. That authority and power is this. If she takes the cup from his hands and she takes a single sip and hands it back to him, she has just told all of you guys, I will take this man, and she has ratified the covenant. However, here's the power and authority that's given to her. She can call the wedding off right now. But only here and only now. If she gets that cup and it's pushed in her direction, and now think of the theological implications of this as we know it. If she gets the cup and she doesn't want this man, and she pushes the cup back, she would, now think of the connotations, she rejects the cup, saying, I don't want this man. What happens? Everybody is outraged, fist fights break out, people start shouting and yelling and running in circles and all these things, chaos breaks out. But one thing I will tell you, nobody but nobody doubts her right to do what she just did because she's given that right. And so the cup is poured. Now before we find out what's really going to happen here, we have a question.
Yes, I object. First, no.
Ceremonial wine, so it's straight, it's not diluted, it's the really good stuff, but she's only going to take a sip, so he pours the cup, he hands it over towards his bride. What will she do? She takes it. And she takes a sip, and everybody shouts, "Hey!" You're not going to have fist fights, you're not going to have a riot, this is marvelous. It's going to
Pass that cup over here,
Now hold on to it, don't drop it. So, at this point, their marriage is now ratified after they have, now take a sip, you take a sip now. So he takes a sip after she takes a sip. You do not take the first sip, she does. Once she does, then you do. That's the order of things, it's very important. And once you take that sip, everybody shouts again. Now they are officially married. But yet they're still betrothed. They're married, but they're betrothed. How does that work? Well, I'll explain it in a minute, but let me step through these guys. I'm going to leave you here for just a second, okay? Now, you need to know something about what they just did. They just partook of a covenant. When you get married, and when you guys got married, you guys made a covenant with each other. But you may not have known that. When I do a wedding, I do premarital counseling. All my premarital counseling is straight from the Bible. Because people lose notes, people lose workbooks, people throw them away, but you always have your Bible. So they take the notes out of the Bible. And the Bible talks about covenants. And one of the great covenants in the Bible is marriage. Now, what is a covenant? When I do premarital counseling, and when I do, and I need you guys to stay here, okay? When I do marriage counseling, somebody's marriage is on the rocks, then I always ask them the same things. I start off by saying, what is marriage? And I get the same answer from couples every single time. So if I do your premarital counseling someday, which I probably won't, but if I did, I don't want to hear these words come out of your mouth. This is what I hear every single time when I ask people what is marriage. I hear,
Really?
every single time. And then it's followed by something else. When I hear that word, I know that what's coming next, they're not prepared to answer. They're going to be making it up as they go along. They're going to base it on maybe something they heard or something they thought, but they're making up the answer when somebody begins a statement with, and the bride does it too. What is marriage to you? And it's about the same thing. But they give you these answers and it could be all over the place. Marriage is a time when God brings two people together. We're there to be together until death us do part. Well, that's pretty close. It's pretty good. Well, a marriage is when two people come together and they make a contract and they agree with one another that they are going to be together for the rest of their lives and they will love one another and honor one another and cherish one another and all that stuff. They say all of this. But they have no idea what they're talking about. Not the first clue. Because marriage in America and in most of the Western world is now sentiment, but it's not covenant. The whole idea of covenant was forgotten about 115 years ago, right around the turn of 1900. Because, frankly, nobody knows. People used to know what a covenant was, and they forgot. And marriage became sentiment, and divorce became prevalent. Because sentiment doesn't hold people together, and a covenant does. Now, when I do premarital counseling and marriage counseling, after I ask what is marriage, we will finally end up at marriage is a covenant. They go, great, all right. Then I ask them the bigger question. Okay, so what's a covenant? And I get that same one-word answer again. It's a contract. It's a deal. It's a vows. It's a public declaration. Well, it's all of those things to a certain extent, but none of those things really. A covenant is something that makes two people one person. Now, to us, we say that's mystical. What else makes two people one person? We covered that last week. What is it?
Breaking bread.
Breaking bread with each other, because they eat with each other and makes them physically one. And the people, even though it's a mystical experience, it didn't really happen, like you're not really that person's brother. You can test DNA now and know it didn't happen that way, but it's still, in their minds, it really made them one. That's the way covenants were designed, so that people would understand it makes them one to that extent. Now let me give you an example of how a covenant works. These guys just made a covenant using the cup. And they had the other issues that they did there, they exchanged the gifts and all that, and they did the cup, and that ratified the covenant. I like to think of a covenant like this. Let's say that you have an older brother. Now you probably do, some of you do, and I'll describe your older brother as being eccentric. You might be thinking, how do you know my older brother? But you have an older brother. Your older brother is a nice guy, he's smart, but he's a half a bubble off a plum. Your older brother, you haven't seen him in a while. But he calls you up on the phone one day and he says, I have some good news and bad news. Really? What? He said, the good news is this. I just won the Indiana State Powerball lottery. I'm a billionaire. Wow, that's great. Here's the bad news. You know how I don't like people, I don't like technology, and I don't like the modern world. So with my $1 billion, I bought an island way out in the South Pacific where only I know where it is, and a few people will stock it with a house and all the food I need to last for the rest of my life. And I'm going to go there and live, and I love you, but I will never see you again. Now here's my question. Then they go there and they do it. They go there and they do it. Here's my question. Are they still your brother? Yes. Are they still your brother?
Yes.
The answer is yes. I'm glad you said no. A lot of people do say no because they don't understand what's really going on here. And that's really easy to do. Yes, he's still your brother. Why?
Because he's your brother.
Because you're blood, right?
Because if you ever do see it.
Yeah, exactly. Because you're blood. Now, stay with me. Stay with me. When is your brother no longer your brother?
When he dies.
When he dies. When one of you dies. You mean your brother is no longer your brother when, until death do you part?
But wouldn't you say that's still my dead brother?
Now, let me go on. Just a minute. Watch this. These two just made a covenant. When you make a covenant, the witnesses are witnessing something very, very interesting. They're seeing two people who came from separate families. When they make this covenant, now they are as much brother and sister as they are husband and wife. This is what a covenant did, and this is why the old Anglican Book of Common Prayer, no, I'm not an Anglican, but they did have some interesting things that came out of their church. Out of the old Anglican Book of Common Prayer, written way back in the 1600s, the typical ceremony for most weddings that you will use when you get married, chances are, ends each set of vows with the phrase, until do us part. And it's not because it's sentiment, it's because it was written way before 1900, and these people understood the same meaning of a covenant. That when two people got together, they were now not just mystically related, but somehow miraculously physically related to each other, which is why Moses and Paul said, a man will leave his father and mother and cleave only unto his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And then Paul adds later, this is a great mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church. But the two becoming one flesh, we often say that means, and it's said 3 times in the Bible, it's talking about sexual union. It is not, it's talking about a covenant. Sexual union comes as a result of the covenant, but it's speaking of the covenant because the two make the covenant and now they're seen as brother and sister. They are one flesh. They're related to each other. That's why I tell people whose marriage is on the rocks, I say to them, this is what you did. Well, I didn't do that. Yes, you did. You didn't know it at the time, but that's what was happening. You were making a covenant with each other. Let me tell you, your foundation is bedrock solid because you made it on a covenant. If you recognize the covenant, don't get the jackhammers out and start breaking up the marriage. Realize that the house is a mess. Fix the house, but the foundation is just fine because you guys are related to each other. That's a covenant. That's what a covenant does. God made a covenant with Abraham, remember? God made a covenant with Moses. God made a covenant with the people of Israel. God calls himself what relationship to those people? A husband. And he calls them his wife. And this is why God could never disown the people of Israel. Because he is now their divine kinsman. He's now related to them. And we are related to the Father through Jesus because we are related through something called a new covenant in his blood. Remember? We're now, when Jesus calls us brothers or sisters, he's not saying that as sentiment or a happy little cute idea that you want. I just want you to remember this image. He's drawing upon them a covenant relationship that has made us related to him. How did I get related to him? I want you to watch this. So I step back in here. Have you got your cup? There's your cup. Okay, take your cup. So you give her the cup, take the sip again. We're going to demonstrate this again. She takes the sip, and then he takes the sip. Everybody shouts! Hey! Officially married. Now that the amen is said, it starts to die down. Then the bridegroom has rehearsed a line. And the line he says in the presence of all the witnesses, now that they are officially one person, now they are related to each other, he says, you are now covenanted to me by the laws of Moses and Israel, and I will not drink of this cup again until I drink it anew with you in my Father's house.
Yeah.
Shocking, isn't it? That's where it came from. When Jesus said this at the Last Supper, he gives the cup. Remember, he says, this is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for many for the remission of sins. And I will not drink this cup again until I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom. What do you think the disciples heard when they heard him say that? They're Galileans. What did they hear? Wedding. They heard wedding. They heard covenant because that's the way you made a covenant. And that's the way you made a marriage covenant. If it were just a covenant, he wouldn't have had to say, I will not drink of this cup again until I drink it anew with you in my Father's house or kingdom when he said it. But when they heard that, they said, he's talking about a wedding. I wonder what he meant by that. Because he's talking about a wedding. And he was talking about a wedding. Remember, bride of Christ, and he's the bridegroom. But Jesus even referred to himself in those terms through parables and through other means by which we don't even have time to begin to touch that today. This is the beginning of the covenant, and this is where Jesus declares himself at the Last Supper, the bridegroom who now has a bride. And these guys are now betrothed to him, as it were, because he passed that cup around, and they all took the sip of the ceremonial wine at the Last Supper. I told you I was going to tell you about the cup. And now, when we partake of communion, we partake of the bread. You know about the bread. Now, when you partake of the cup, we proclaim the Lord's death, past, until he comes, future. Why is that? Because now that they've made this covenant, they have one more thing that they have to do. And then they part company for a year until the bridegroom comes to get his bride and take her to the official wedding. It's a wedding, guys. Jesus at the Last Supper declares a wedding, as it were. And he declares himself the bridegroom, and he declares his relationship to his disciples through his blood on the cross, which he says is like the wine in this cup. You are now related to me by covenant, and I cannot deny myself. So, he passes the cup back to me. And then the bridegroom is handed a veil to give to the bride, and the bride takes the veil and she puts it across her face, and then she tucks it into her, the headscarf that she's got there, and everybody watches watches her do this, and as she does that, well, anyway, you get the idea. You can see how it works. This actually isn't designed to do that sort of thing, but you can see how kind of it works. She looks like a very, very
She's beautiful.
beautiful terrorist. It's-
Take it.
There you go. You get the picture of the bride. These are the wedding pictures here.
Yeah.
So she puts the veil on. Now, when she puts the veil on, everybody shouts.
Amen.
The reason she puts the veil on is this. During her betrothal time, which lasts 1 year, every time she leaves the house, she will put her veil on and she wears it out in public. When she gets home, she takes it off. But when she's out in public, she always puts the veil on. The veil says, I am taken. Don't even think about it if you're thinking about it. That I now belong to a very good man because I accepted him. I took his cup. And therefore, we are one now. But I am still betrothed. I'm in that betrothal state. So we haven't come together as husband and wife yet, but we are legally married. But we haven't come together yet to live as husband and wife. And that veil also means something else. Since we haven't come together as husband and wife, I am keeping myself pure for him, for he is a great man. That's why she wears the veil, and that's the declaration. You guys, I'm gonna sermonize just for a second. Christians are the bride of Christ. We are the bride of Christ. You still wear a veil. This is why purity for Christians is mandatory, because it is our veil. I keep myself pure because my bridegroom is coming for me. That's our veil that we wear when we're out in public. We're not hiding our faces in this manner, but we are saying that when I'm wearing my purity, which I wear all the time, and I especially wear it in public, not that I don't wear it in private, but I wear it in public especially, that people will see that I belong to someone who is not of this world, that I belong to a great bridegroom, and he is marvelous. And I think that any Christian that doesn't keep themselves pure hasn't seen Jesus. They haven't seen their bridegroom, because he is something marvelous. So our purity is our veil. Don't take it off. Now I need to say one more thing. These guys are now going to part ways, and they're going to go their ways for a year, and they're not going to live as husband and wife. And she's going to be wearing her veil. Well, you can leave it on there, it's all right. She's going to be wearing her veil the whole time. This is what you needed to know about Joseph and Mary becoming pregnant by the Holy Spirit, because Joseph had a bride who was betrothed to him, Mary. And they found she was pregnant by the Holy Spirit. It happened during their betrothal period.
Oh.
See the problem?
Yes.
Mary is pure. Mary is a virgin. Mary is pregnant by the Holy Spirit. And she, being betrothed to Joseph, Joseph wants to divorce her quietly because apparently there was great affection between the two. Maybe they got married not on arrangement so much as maybe they loved each other. But either way, Joseph is going to put her away quietly so that she doesn't get killed by being stoned to death for getting pregnant during the betrothal period. And of course he has a dream, and the Lord tells him in a dream, don't be afraid to take her as your wife and name the child Jesus. And he does. In the meantime, Mary goes for a few months down to Elizabeth, comes back, and she's showing. She's still a betrothed bride. Does she keep her veil on or not? It's a very good question, isn't it? But she's pure. She's never done anything wrong. She's entitled to keep the veil on. She probably in the neighborhood had to take it off because people would have stoned her because she's lying through her teeth, they would have thought. So it was a very, very difficult thing. But even though she is pure and she's doing the Lord's will, that there in Bethlehem, when they come, actually Nazareth rather, before they actually have to go down to Bethlehem, she probably had to take her veil off because seeing a veiled woman that was pregnant was a contradiction in terms. And yet it was the truth with her. So, this is our bride and our groom. The veil is on. She's ready to go back to her house. Everybody shouts, one more resounding!
Amen!
No, one more resounding!
Amen!
And of course, everybody's happy, everybody breaks up, the beggars go back to begging, the merchants go back to selling, the caravans get on their way, the families pack up the chuppah, everybody starts cheering and shouting, all the guys and the family members get around the bridegroom, and they sing and dance through the streets, escorting him back to his father's house. They take the bride, and they get around her, and they escort her back to her parents' house, and then they begin preparations. Would you guys give these guys a hand for helping me?
Yeah.
Goes from there. She goes home with her mom, and there for a year she has a project to embark on. What she has to do is she's got to make herself a wedding dress. Now, in some villages, they had wedding dresses that were actually rentable. They would keep them stored somewhere, and you could pay a certain amount of money to rent one. But if you were poor, you kind of had to make your own. And what you would do to make your own, every time a caravan comes through, they're carrying stuff. So you're going to barter and trade and do whatever you can to get bits and pieces of cloth, because wedding dresses in those days, the bigger, the better. The more stuff you had hanging off of you gals, the more it was loved. They loved it. Now, how do you know this? Well, first of all, you can go and read, and I encourage you to go and read Ezekiel chapter 16. It's a very sad chapter in Ezekiel, but it describes a wedding dress from 700 years before Jesus, back in that era. So, and it's everything that it's described. It's massive, it's billowing, it's made out of layers of cloth. It's got jewelry all over it, even if it's cheap imitation jewelry. But the best look of a wedding dress of that era that we could find was among the Yemenite Jews, because they were isolated for so long in Yemen when they were discovered just, it was 100 or 200 years ago, whatever it was, that their customs probably hadn't changed since the fall of the temple. And their wedding dresses look like this.
Holy cow.
What the heck? I
Can't see that far.
That's a lot of bling.
That's a lot of bling. You see all the necklaces hanging off. They'd be filled with spices that smelled good. Some of the metal ones, like little flasks, would be filled with perfume. And then they would jingle and jangle, and you'd be walking around. Ladies, don't fall into a lake. You're going straight to the bottom by the neck, because of all that stuff hanging off of you. Huge headdress that you would be wearing, and a big headscarf and a facial scarf that would have now your dowry, that would be actually punched holes through the coins would be sewn on around the edge of the scarf that you're wearing, so that it would show your dowry and show it off. And then you would have this huge dress made up of all these different bits and pieces of clothing. You'd spend a whole year getting this together. You'd also get together your bridesmaids, and you'd arrange for them. Of course, they might be your sisters, they might be your best friends, all female, and you're going to have bowls with oil lamps in them, with the lamps with the oil in them ready to go, and then wicks ready to light, with a pilot light burning at all times as the day grew close to the wedding, which would be a year away. You want to make sure you have those, because if the bridegroom comes at night, you don't want to get missed because he couldn't find you. That was the idea. So make sure that you have the lamps lit and ready to go. So they have that. As the wedding day gets closer, the bride with her bridesmaids, because they know the wedding day is coming, will sleep together in a small room. You saw how small the rooms were in those houses. She would cram in there with her bridesmaids, and they would sleep in the same room, and the bride would sleep in her wedding dress. Because why? When the bridegroom comes, she's got to be ready. So when the bridegroom comes, the bridesmaids dust her off and get her ready to go. Now, the bridegroom, the bridegroom, he's got a whole different task. And so does his father. The father of the bride has, if he's wealthy, now this is if it's a wealthier family, what he does is he begins to put together robes that are all white linen. And all the guests that he invites, and he's got to invite all the right people, when he invites a guest, he has a white linen robe for every single guest, man or woman, that comes through the gate of his house on the wedding day of his son. He has all these robes ready. It serves two purposes. Number one, it honors the guest. You're giving them quite a valuable piece of clothing, and it's a new piece of clothing. And they may be very poor, and this might be a real blessing for them. So a white linen garment. But it's there for another reason too. Remember the parable of the great banquet? The parable of the great banquet, where a rich man, a king, was going to get married. And of course he gives all these wedding invitations out, and he's given horrible lame excuses, and then he just impels all the people out in the streets to come in, and finally even the Gentiles to come in. And when they come into his great palace where he's having his wedding, they notice a man. They're not wearing his wedding clothes, which would be a white linen garment. He's wearing his street clothes, and they have him thrown out. The reason why they have the linen garments, the other reason, is to catch gate crashers. Because they won't have these. Only your guests are going to have the linen garments. The gate crashers, which are usually people who are either mischievous or very, very hungry. Either way, they're going to try and come in among a big crowd and not be noticed. If you're all wearing white linen garments, then when a gate crasher comes in, he sticks out like a sore thumb, and the master of the house threw him out. See, where there was the wailing and gnashing of teeth. You remember the parable. So he begins to put together the linen garments. The son, however, has two tasks ahead of him. The first one, he's got to put together a banquet. Remember our biblical dinner? Imagine that set up with wine, with oil, with more than that, perhaps even meat, to last for 7 days and nights. He's got to get a lot of food. Where's he going to get this? Especially if it's a poor peasant. He's got to be really, really clever, and he's got to work really hard. He's got to trade a lot of labor or goods or whatever he can come up with in order to get all of that. He's got to get this feast together. And then the second thing he has to do, you heard this at the Nazareth village when we were visiting the house, when we were talking in the Weavers area. When a couple gets married in those days, well, in our day and age, they go out and they get their own house, their own apartment, they move somewhere, they start their own lives together. Not so in those days. The husband and wife, the new bride and groom, would now go to live at the father of the bridegroom's house. That means the son, the bridegroom, he has to add a room onto that house. This is why those houses get so weird. When you look at the foundations of these houses in these ruins around here, they just kind of go every which way. If you could see one fully restored, like the one over here at the Katsrine Talmudic village where they actually restored a house, you can see, man, it's like the Winchester Mystery House. It just keeps going out and out and out because they keep adding on to the house for however many weddings take place, because the sons bring their brides home and they live there the rest of their lives in the compound. This is how they actually built their families up. Yes?
What happens when like grandpa and grandma pass on?
Then somebody else would occupy the room. Maybe they could move into a better room and they'd use the other one for storage or other purposes, or have another family member move in. Could be that. So it didn't expand like some sort of exponential growth or something like that, but it did expand, and a lot of times when they had to add on a room, they would have to add up. Because you're in a village. Villages are tight and compact, and we don't have any more floor space to put another room, so you just add up. And they go up about 3 stories at the most. But could you imagine being a bride in that dress having to climb a ladder on your wedding night? Oh man, that'd be crazy. So the son goes about building this room onto the house. And he begins to build it, get it ready. It's going to be not only the bridal chamber, it's going to be the apartment that they live in, conceivably for the rest of their lives together. This is where they're going to live. John 14, verse 1. Let not your hearts be troubled, Jesus said at the Last Supper, after all the ceremonial parts were done, after he had done the cup with the guys, with the bread first. Let not your hearts be troubled. You believe in God. Believe also in me. For in my Father's house are many mansions. That's the King James version of misunderstanding. Because they didn't know the context in which Jesus was speaking. Listen to the rest of it. I'll just change the word to what it literally translates to. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. And I go there to prepare a place for you. And if I go there to prepare a place for you, I will come to take you to be with me where I am. If it were not so, I would have told you. What did they hear when they heard Jesus say that?
They'll be back in a year.
Wedding! Bridegroom coming back for a bride in a year. I'm going away. They understand that. What's the best way to illustrate it for the guys? A wedding. Because a bridegroom who is now betrothed to his bride, this is the cup of the covenant, remember? For the remission of sins poured out for many. And I will not drink of this cup again until I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom. I go there to prepare a place for you. And if I go there to prepare a place for you, I will come back to take you to be with me where I am. Don't let your hearts be troubled, because he's telling them I'm going to go away. See what's happening? He's painting the picture for them very clearly of a wedding. Because that's what a bridegroom did. It literally would be translated, in my Father's house are many bridal chambers. That's what it would come out to be in the context in which it is. He's talking about a wedding. So, the bride puts her dress together, gets her friends together, gets the lamps together. The bridegroom, he gets the feast together, and then he gets the room all taken care of, and the day is approaching. They know the wedding day is coming, and it's right on top of them. I mean, the wedding day is right there, and then the bridegroom goes to his father and says, "Father, I'm done." When the bridegroom is done, it's over. So the bridegroom goes to his father and says, "Come and look." The father knows what's going on, but it's sort of ceremonial, and he goes and he checks out the feast, and "Oh, very good, son, look at this. Where did you get all that wine? And look at all that oil. And oh, a nice triclinium table. We're going to have a marvelous feast." And it's there in, of course, the courtyard of the family house. And then he's very impressed. He says, "Now let me see the bridal chamber." And he takes him up the ladder to the next room, and the room is up there. It's freshly plastered, and he pounds on the walls a little bit, and he sees the bed over there, which in this case would probably be straw covered with a blanket or something like that. Fresh straw, very good. And all the things in there, torchlight and all of that. "Oh, it's very nice, son. You've done a very, very good job." And then the son says, "Okay, Dad, want to get my bride?" And the dad says, "I'll tell you when." This is what makes a Galilean wedding a Galilean wedding, as opposed to a Judean wedding, as opposed to any other type of wedding in the region. Every wedding in the region knew when the wedding was going to take place. The Galileans added one little rub. It was a surprise wedding. The bride has to be ready, because the bridegroom will only be able to come when the father tells him to go. No man knows the day or the hour, not the angels of heaven, not even the Son, of the coming of the Son of Man. That, to a Galilean, is a specific reference to a wedding. Remember, all the things that Jesus says start with a thing. That's the thing. He is not making a statement that's abstract. He's not playing with riddles. He says, he's talking about a wedding. I will come back, but it will be like your weddings. And remember, Peter's already married. We know that much because he had a mother-in-law. So Peter's married. He's been through this. How many other guys have been through this? We don't know. But they've all been through the process. And so it's a surprise wedding. And they heard their own wedding custom. Why? Because all of Jesus' disciples are
Galileans.
They're Galileans. They know this. So the son waits. The bride's ready. She knows it's going to be around this time because rumors circulate, because you don't just, you got to be proper about this. People have to be ready. There's got to be communication going back and forth of some sort. But they all know that the bridegroom will come when least expected, which usually meant in the middle of the night. That was the fun part. So, the bridegroom's buddies, his brothers, his groomsmen, they stay with him. They pack into this room at night. The bride's sisters and her bridesmaids, they're packed in with her. And she's sleeping in her wedding gown. And they have white linen garments that they have to wear too. And then one night, in the middle of the night, a guy comes walking in over all these bodies in this room. He's carrying a little oil lamp in his hand. And there's the son. He goes, "Son, wake up." "Yeah, Dad." "Son, get up." "Why?" "Son." "What?" "Go get your bride." Boing! And he springs to his feet. And all the guys start waking up. What's going on? The bridegroom starts pounding on walls, shouting whatever he can. "Wake up, wake up. We're going to go get the bride." And they get all very excited. He grabs a shofar, steps out onto the roof, wherever he has to do that, and he blows it at the top of his lungs. Why? He's going to wake up the whole village. Why? Because the guests are out there, and this is the way you gather the guests. You have to alert them. So he blows the shofar as loud as he can. He comes back inside. The guys start singing. They dance around him. They revel around the bridegroom because he's the man of the hour. He's the most important part of the wedding. Nowadays it's the bride. Back then it was the bridegroom. And they start shouting, "The bridegroom is coming. The bridegroom is coming. The bridegroom is coming." They get musical instruments. They get tambourines. They get drums. And then they get torches. And they start lighting torches. It begins to light up the whole house in that part of the neighborhood. And then they rush outside as one man out into the street with some guys carrying a litter, which is basically a platform or a chair between two poles. And it's all dressed out with with veils and cloth just to make it look pretty. And here go these guys running through the streets shouting, the bridegroom is coming, the bridegroom is coming, and blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Baruch haba b'shem Adonai. They keep shouting that as they're going through. They've got to wake everybody up. The people in the neighborhood start waking up as these guys serpentine through the streets. They don't take the most direct route to the bride's house. They're working their way through, and as they go through, people are coming down off the roofs and coming out of their rooms, throwing their robes on, grabbing a torch, whatever they have to do, and they get in line with the processional, because this is the way they collect the guests. The guests come and they get in line with the guys. So the line of guys, the groomsmen, led by the bridegroom, shouting at the top of his lungs, the bridegroom is coming, because he's the bridegroom. He alerts people to that. And occasionally blowing the shofar, the line gets longer and longer and longer. So you have this huge mass of people serpentining through the streets until finally they start to approach the bride's house. The bride hears this. This is her alarm clock. She wakes up. Suddenly the gals have to dust her off. They have to dust themselves off. They straighten all the wrinkles. They make sure her makeup's right. She's got her hands all painted up like henna. It's not a tattoo. It washes off. So they're allowed to do this. And the palms of her hands are even painted, because she's not supposed to do any work. So that's why they paint their hands like that. And she's just absolutely beautiful. They light the oil lamps. Remember Matthew chapter 25, verse 1, the parable of the 10 virgins? The bridegroom is coming, and half of the virgins, the bridesmaids, had oil for their lamps, and the other half didn't. And the ones that didn't have oil for their lamps had to go find some to put in their lamps, because there's only enough oil for each lamp. So 5 of them were left out tragically, and the other 5 got to go with the bride when the bridegroom came for her. That's what that parable is all about. Same thing is happening here. They get bowls with the lamps. Remember, they kept in the bowls because they didn't want to lose any oil, but they're going to step outside with the lamps, and the wind could blow them out if they're not in bowls. So they've got to put them in something protected. So at night, they would take these, the bridegroom would step outside, the bridesmaids would be around her, they'd all be holding bowls of light like this. Can you imagine how that looked in the street with no street lamps? Oh my gosh, I saw it happen just one time during a biblical Galilean wedding that I did in Indiana, when we had all the bridesmaids lined up in a processional, because when I do one of these, we have enough people and enough people watching, when we actually do a processional. We do it in costume. And these gals are decked out to the max, and they're running down this hallway, and before we come out and make all this ruckus shouting, because I mean it's just absolutely deafening, piercing noise when we come in, you can see all of the women lined up down the hall holding bowls with lamps in them, and somebody turned all the lights out. I'd never seen that before in all the years that I've done this. And I almost hit the floor. It was so beautiful. It was amazing, because they were just lit from below by these lamps. And they're standing out in the street waiting for the bridegroom to come, because that's where they have to go. He doesn't come knock on the door. They have to be ready. They've got to be out in the street. So they get out in the street, and they can hear the whole processional coming, the parade's coming down, revelers led by the bridegroom. They come around the corner, and there they are. I don't know if that would stop that man in his tracks or not. I sure would. In the meantime, here come the guys with the litter, the chair between the poles, and they barge past the bridegroom. They set the thing down, and the bride knows exactly what to do, because everybody knows in those days that she steps out and she gets onto the litter, and then the guys, now listen to me. It's a surprise wedding. The lamps are lit. The bride is ready. Here comes the litter. They set it down. She sits down on the litter. They pick her up and lift her off the ground. And then with the bridegroom leading, they make a beeline to the father's house now, not traversing through the streets. They go in a straight line as much as they can, with the bride right behind the bridegroom, flying her to the father's house, where they go inside the compound along with all the guests, where the door is locked, nobody goes out, and nobody comes in for 7 days. This is why I believe in a pre-tribulation rapture, and I'm convinced of it. Because all the verses that we're taught that says pre-tribulation rapture, this verse may or may not do it. Oh, there's a gap between Revelation chapter 3 and chapter 4. That's the end of the church age. That's the rapture. You're grabbing at straws. But if you think like a Galilean, a pre-tribulation rapture is exactly what's being spoken about when Jesus talks about coming for his bride. Because once they're inside that compound, outside is the wailing and gnashing of teeth for 7 days and nights. It's so obvious, a Galilean could see it. But because we're not Galileans, it's kind of hard to see. This is precisely why I am convinced of a pre-tribulation rapture, because it fits the model perfectly. And now you can see it too. That's a Galilean wedding. For the Lord will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel and a trumpet blast, and the dead in Christ shall rise first, and we who are alive and remain will be caught up in the air to meet them, and so we will be together with the Lord forever. Encourage one another with these words.
Amen.
That's Thessalonians. Those were Greeks in Macedonia. And Paul wrote it, and Paul wasn't a Galilean. The message was intact even there and even then. It's a Galilean wedding. And no one knows the day or the hour. Not even the Son, not the angels of heaven. Only the Father knows, which is why Jesus 10 times said, be ready, 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 be ready. Because you don't know when I'm coming. Be ready. You wear your wedding dress. Bride, you put on your veil. And you end up in the Father's house. And when you get there, they sit down at a big table, kind of like our triclinium meal that we had here. And as they sit down at the table, people begin to pray over the people. They present them with gifts. They put blessings on them. And then the bride and the groom do something extraordinary. The bride and the groom then produce something that the family hands them, which is a little pouch of salt, each from each different family. They take a plate and they pour the salt right out onto the plate. Both pouches, one from each family. And then they stir it together. This is called a covenant of salt. And then what happens is the bridegroom takes some bread and he breaks it. And he tears off 2 small pieces. And he dips each one in the salt, and then he gives one to his bride, and he takes one himself. Makes them one. But what's more interesting is that salt. This is called a covenant of salt. And the reason it does what it does, it ratifies this marriage, is that both that salt, the grains of the salt, came from 2 different families. Once you mix them together, try and sort them out. They're inseparably blended. You could take all eternity and try and sort them out, and you're never going to get it right. They're together. That's the first part. The second thing that happens after they take that piece of bread, the bridegroom then takes that ceremonial cup that he used a year ago, and that pitcher that he used a year ago, and he pours the wine straight, and then he takes the first sip in his Father's house. That ceremonial cup of the covenant. And then he hands it to her, and she takes a sip, and everybody shouts,
Amen.
because they have now re-ratified their covenant publicly, but now they are husband and wife. She has now removed her veil in order to take that sip. And they are officially husband and wife. If that all sounds a little bit familiar, it's probably where we get our tradition of the wedding cake and the champagne toast at our weddings. You say, well, that's really stretching it. Not really. Because after the fall of the temple, the Jews took their traditions. This tradition would be sort of universal in this region, not just with the Galileans. And they took their traditions to Europe, to Eastern Europe, and eventually moved west, came across the ocean, and people marry, and they mix up families, and this thing just kind of took off. It's probably where we got our wedding cake and our champagne toast. Same sort of thing. That's why when I do weddings, I say, hey, you guys, now listen, I'm going to tell you the story. And I tell them what I just told you. And I say, when you go to eat the cake, and you take that first cut, and you go to give each other the first bite, I'm going to ask a favor of you. No matter what people say or how much they egg you on, please don't cram it up each other's noses and smash it in your face. Take that first bite and realize I'm ratifying my covenant. And put it in each other's mouth. Then after that, I don't care what you do with the cake, but make that first one count. And the people, they won't care. They'll go, ah, who cares? Because this is the ratification of your covenant. They go, yeah, now they're thinking about covenant at their own wedding, when you can really forget because of all the overwhelming stuff that you have to do. And then, when they're done with that, at one point, the bridegroom then stands up, takes his bride by the hand, and they disappear and go into the bridal chamber. And while everybody parties, they consummate the marriage. And then they come back out, there's more ceremony, and the party goes into high gear. You say, that's really embarrassing. Yeah, look at JD going, no way.
No.
That's what they did.
So weird.
Yeah, it seemed hard to us. That's what they did, and everybody was happy. Now, that's your Galilean wedding. That's the way it worked. But, shh, that's your Galilean wedding. And that's the way it worked. And that's what happened. And I'm leaving out lots of details because there's so much. But that's enough to go on right now, wouldn't you say? Except for one thing. You see, there's one more part. And it's over in Revelation chapter 19. Where Jesus now becomes the center of attention in the universe. John is in heaven, as it were. It's either a vision or he's been taken there somehow. And he says, and then I heard, as it were, what did he hear? A great multitude. Now, the last time John saw a great multitude, it was angels, 10,000 times 10,000, and thousands upon thousands. In other words, I can't number them, there's too many. And outside of them, a number of saints in heaven, more than he could count. He didn't even try. So there are going to be a lot of people in heaven, and I'm so glad about that. And they're surrounding it. It's this vast mass, and they were all singing and shouting. Now he hears, as it were, a great multitude, like the roar of a waterfall, like rushing waters, like loud peals of thunder, shouting, "Hallelujah! For the Lord God Almighty reigns. Let us be glad and rejoice, and give him glory. For the marriage of the Lamb, Jesus, has come, and the bride has made herself ready." And then it says, fine linen, white and clean, was given her to wear. And then he puts in parentheses, as it were, fine linen stands for the righteous works of the saints. All of what I just told you, you can see Jesus speaking of prophetically in the Scriptures. And it's all pointing towards one event. The marriage feast of the Lamb. Jesus kept talking about that event. And he kept saying, this is where I'm going, and this is where you're going when I come back for you. This is where we're going. And I'm the bridegroom, and you're the bride. And we're covenanted together, and it's like a marriage. And one day, this is what's going to happen in heaven. And then John sees it, and he reports it to us. That's the marriage feast of the Lamb. Jesus is going to have that. We're betrothed at the Last Supper. Now we're going to be married to him someday. We proclaim his death until he comes. Comes for what? To get us to be a bride. We're already betrothed to him. I remember my wedding. My wedding took place on June 16th, 1979 at Calvary Chapel of Costa Mesa. Officiated not by Pastor Chuck Smith, but by the pastor of our choice, a little short guy shaped like a fire hydrant, about that tall, who was a 33-year master sergeant, talked like W.C. Fields, and his name was Romaine. Maybe you've heard of Romaine, he's legendary. He's with the Lord now too, but what a guy. And Romaine was our officiant at the wedding, and we had 350 people at our wedding. But it was in Calvary Chapel of Costa Mesa, a sanctuary that holds 2,760 people, so they were just a blip in the middle. And I remember being out there, I want my bride. I wanted her the day before. I really wanted her. I mean, you think about a bridegroom, and you think about Jesus waiting for his bride. He's in heaven right now, and he's at the right hand of his Father. What's he doing there? Father, yes, I'm making intercession for my people. Thank you, son. Father, I want my bride. Okay, son, someday. Fine. No, listen, when you're a bridegroom and you're wanting your bride, you want your bride. I want to get married. I want to be with her now. I want her to be with me now. I don't want a bachelor party. I want to be with my bride. I remember my bachelor party. My friend comes and kidnaps me, my best man, at my wedding rehearsal dinner. He was there. He says, get in my car. I get into an AMC Pacer. If you don't know what that is, you haven't seen A Nightmare on Wheels. We get in this thing, and we drive over to Knott's Berry Farm. They just opened up a brand new ride, Montezuma's Revenge. Oh man, I go on this thing. We rode this thing 5 or 10 times. We just kept doing it, and all I can think is, I really want my bride. I want Kathy now. And so we did this till 2 in the morning and played around and had fun, and we stayed sober. We weren't drinking or anything. And then we go off, and I go to bed, and Grendel, my roommate, who was my best man, he goes back to the apartment. I'm now in the apartment Kathy and I will be in, and she's home with her parents. And the next day, I don't see her in the morning at all. And at noon, we're going to get married. And I walk out on that stage, 50 pounds lighter than you see me now, hair going down my back, so if I put my head back, I can grab it. Those are me. Fu Manchu mustache, wearing an all-white polyester tuxedo. Hey, it gets better. With the ruffles. Yeah. And I'm standing up there looking like a really hairy glass of milk. And as I'm standing there, all my groomsmen are off to my right, standing next to me. They walked out on the stage wearing the same style polyester suit, except all in the very trendy light blue.
Oh my God.
With the ruffles. And as they stand there, they're smiling, and I'm standing on the stage smiling, and the pastor's behind me just looking very stern because he's this tough guy. And my friend's playing music over for us, and as the music begins, it changes, and the doors at the back of the church open, and it's a bridesmaid. I knew they were coming, but I had never been so disappointed to see her. And she walks down, and another bridesmaid, and another bridesmaid, and then finally the matron of honor comes down, and they're holding the bouquets, and as the matron of honor comes down and ascends the stage, and she's the last one, she looks over at me and she winks, like, I know something you don't know, you're really going to like this. And they come up and they line up on the stage, and then the music changes, the doors close, and then the doors open again. And there's Kathy. There she is. And she had cut her hair, which is surprising. My hair was now longer than hers. And her hair, since she cut it, wasn't brown anymore. It looked almost black, with this white gown that she's wearing with a veil that actually cascaded all the way down to where her hands held the bouquet of white flowers with these dark green shiny leaves that came all the way down almost to her toes. And she stood there in the most beautiful wedding dress I have ever seen to this day. Well, on her arm is her father, Robert Alexander, who has a completely shaved head.
Oh God.
And he's wearing the light blue polyester suit with the ruffles. But he looks like a WWF wrestler poured into this suit. And his chest is out because he's a big man. And he's bald, so it looks like he's got a pack of hot dogs behind his neck where the wrinkles are. And on his arm is his daughter. And they begin to walk down the aisle. The Jesu joy of man's desiring. And I am blown away because I can see her looking at me all the way from the back of the church. And even though my teeth are incredibly crooked, hers are perfect and white. And the smile is for me as she walks down. And I'm going, this is amazing. And her father is looking at me like, yeah, you better treat her right. I get down to the bottom. And there's 4 steps that used to lead down. They've redesigned the church, but there were 4 steps there. And I walk down the 4 steps, and he hands her off to me, and I take her arm, and we ascend up onto the stage. And Romaine begins speaking, and I don't care, because I have my bride. And I look at her through that veil, and she's looking at me. She's not looking at Romaine, she's looking at me. And her eyes are just glistening. It's like Disneyland fireworks going off. And a perfect smile. Yeah, my bride. I finally have my bride. And I look at that and I say, so what is Jesus' wedding with us going to look like? I have no idea. But I'm going to tell you something that will probably amaze you if you meditate on it long enough. And you may not even need to meditate on it very long. I want you to remember this verse. I know you know it. It's over in Ephesians 5, chapter 25. This is really, truly the best description of the marriage feast of the Lamb that's in the Bible, but it's far more than that. Ephesians 5:25 begins like this: husbands, love your wives as
Christ loved the church.
Now, we're just going to draw a line there. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. Listen, cleansing her with the washing with water through the word. The word in the Greek that Paul uses for washing, if it's translated into Hebrew or Aramaic, it only